François Ngeze was the head of state of Burundi from October 21, 1993 to October 27, 1993. He was chosen by the Military Committee of Public Salvation, a group of army officers that overthrew the democratically elected government of President Melchior Ndadaye, who was killed during the coup. Ngeze, one of the few prominent Hutu members of UPRONA, Union for National Progress, at the time, was Interior Minister in the government of Pierre Buyoya, who was defeated by Ndadaye in elections held on June 1, 1993. Following widespread condemnation of the coup, the Committee of Public Salvation was dissolved on October 27. Sylvie Kinigi, Prime Minister in the Ndadaye government, took over as acting president. François Ngeze, born 1953, is a Burundian retired politician. He served as the acting head of state of Burundi from October 21, 1993 to October 27, 1993. He was chosen by the Military Committee of Public Salvation, a group of army officers that staged the 1993 Burundian coup d'état attempt overthrew the democratically elected government of President Melchior Ndadaye, who was killed during the coup attempt. Ngeze, one of the few prominent Hutu members of UPRONA, Union for National Progress, at the time, was Interior Minister in the government of Pierre Buyoya, who was defeated by Ndadaye in elections held on June 1, 1993. Following widespread condemnation of the coup, the Committee of Public Salvation was dissolved on October 27. Sylvie Kinigi, Prime Minister in the Ndadaye government, took over as acting president. François Ngeze was born in 1953 in Isare Commune, Rutgama-Colline, Rwanda, Burundi. Ethnically, he is Hutu. In May 1972 the Burundian regime engaged in anti-Hutu repression, including massive violence. Ngeze was student at the time in Burundi and was arrested by the authorities and imprisoned at Kayanza. By his own account, government administrator Basile Gateretse, a friend of his father, released him from prison and hid him in his home for 2 weeks with his cousin, Cyprien Antaryamira. Once the authorities became suspicious, Gateretse arranged for the two of them to flee across the Ruzizi River into Zaire. Ngeze then went to Rwanda. He earned a university degree in pedagogy and became a teacher at St. Leon Minor Seminary of Kabgayi. He married and fathered 6 children. Ngeze returned to Burundi in 1982. He joined the Union for National Progress, French, Union pour le Progrès National, UPRONA, and became permanent secretary of the party chapter in Bujumbura. He rose to become Governor of Cankuzo Province in 1989 and later Governor of Bujumbura Rural Province. On April 4, 1992 he was sworn in with a new national cabinet as Minister of Interior, becoming the first Hutu to hold the post since 2 decades prior. On October 21, 1993, a coup was attempted in Burundi by a Tutsi-dominated army faction. The coup attempt resulted in assassination of Hutu President Melchior Ndadaye and the deaths of other officials in the constitutional line of presidential succession. François Ngeze was presented as the new president of Burundi by the army, but the coup failed under domestic and international pressure, leaving Prime Minister Sylvie Kinigi in charge of the government. Following a long period of military rule by Tutsi army officers, in the early 1990s Burundi underwent a democratic transition. In June 1993 presidential and parliamentary elections were held and won by the Hutu-dominated Front pour la Démocratie au Burundi, FRODEBU, displacing the ruling Union pour le Progrès National, UPRONA, and President Pierre Buyoya. A new coalition government was installed on July 10 with FRODEBU leader Ndadaye as Burundi's first Hutu president. Ndadaye's tenure was largely peaceful, but during his time in office Burundi was subject to several social and political disruptions. Thousands of Burundian Hutu refugees who had fled previous political violence returned to the country en masse, while the government reconsidered various contracts and economic concessions made by the previous regimes and began reforming the army. These actions threatened the interest of Tutsi business elites and military officers. In this atmosphere, elements in the army began planning a coup. The exact identity of those who led the plot remains unknown, though Ngeze, Army Chief of Staff Jean Bikomagu, ex-President Jean-Baptiste Bagaza, and Buyoya are widely suspected to have been involved. Early in the morning on October 21, 1993, army units took up positions around Bujumbura and mounted an attack on the presidential palace. After several hours, Ndadaye was captured and taken to a military camp where he was murdered. The putschists also targeted key Frodba leaders, killing President of the National Assembly Ponchan Karabwami, Vice President of the National Assembly Jill Bimaziyobut, Minister of Home Affairs and Communal Development Juvenal Ndayikza, and Director of Intelligence Richard Ndikumwami. The deaths of Karabwami and Bimaziyobut eliminated the constitutional line of presidential succession. Other government figures, including Kinigi, survived by fleeing or seeking shelter at the French embassy. Later that day, the army formed a crisis committee and presented Ngeze as the new president of Burundi. The announcement of Ndadaye's death touched off severe ethnic violence, as angered Hutu peasants and Frodba members began murdering Tutsis. The army retaliated by massacring Hutus. The international community and civil society organizations condemned the coup and requested a return to constitutional governance. Faced with these challenges, in the afternoon of October 23, Bikomagu ordered the army to return to its barracks, and 2 days later Kinigi's government announced the abrogation of all emergency measures declared by the putschists. The coup attempt left Prime Minister Kinigi the highest-ranking civilian official to survive the de facto head of state of Burundi. Civilian institutions of government were re-established in earnest in December. Attempts by the National Assembly to elect a successor to Ndadaye were stifled by the Tutsi-dominated Constitutional Court, though the body eventually succeeded in selecting Cyprien Ntaryamira as president of Burundi in January 1994. Ntaryamira died in April and was succeeded by Sylvestre Ntibantunganya, while ethnic violence persisted and UPRONA pushed demands for more favorable constitutional arrangements. Frustrated by this turn of events, some Frodba elements broke away from the party and formed rebel groups, leading to the Burundian Civil War. From the mid-1960s, the country of Burundi was politically dominated by its Tutsi ethnic minority at the expense of the Hutu majority. Union pour le Progrès National, UPRONA, which served as the legal ruling party from 1966, was overwhelmingly made up of Tutsis. Military officers dominated the presidency, coming to power through coups. During this time there were instances of ethnic repression, particularly in 1972 when the Burundian army quashed a Hutu rebellion and then murdered thousands of civilians. In 1987 Pierre Buyoya became president of Burundi following a coup. He initially ignored the country's ethnic strife and perpetuated Tutsi domination of public life. In August 1988 violence broke out and the army massacred thousands of Hutus. Facing substantial foreign pressure, Buyoya initiated reforms designed to end Burundi's systemic ethnic violence, while UPRONA attempted to incorporate more Hutus into its ranks. The Tutsi establishment in the army and security forces nevertheless resisted change. A commission appointed by the president produced a constitution which provided for democratic elections. The document was adopted via referendum in March 1992, followed shortly thereafter by the creation of new political parties. Buyoya scheduled free elections in 1993 and offered himself as UPRONA's presidential candidate. UPRONA's main challenger became Front pour la Démocratie au Burundi, Frodbu, a party largely associated with Hutus. In the June 1 presidential election Buyoya faced Melchior Ndadaye, who was backed by Frodbu. Ndadaye won the election in a landslide, earning 64% of the popular vote. In the subsequent parliamentary elections on June 29, Frodba won 71.4% of the vote and earned 80% of the seats in the National Assembly. The party also took over most local administration, displacing many Tutsi incumbents. Rumors circulated in Burundi that the army would attempt to intervene to disrupt the transition. Ndadaye reassured a supporter that they can kill Ndadaye, but they can't kill all 5 million Ndadayes. A plot from a handful of officers discovered on July 3 to seize Ndadaye's residence failed due to a lack of support from other components of the military, resulting in several arrests, including that of its suspected leader, Lieutenant Colonel Sylvestre Ngeze, who had been chef de cabinet for Buyoya. Buyoya, who had urged the populace to accept the results of the election, condemned the coup attempt, as did the army leadership. Ndadaye was sworn in as president on July 10. He assembled a government of 23 ministers, including 13 Frodbo and 6 UPRONA members. 9 of the ministers were Tutsi, including Prime Minister Sylvie Kinigi, a member of UPRONA. Ndadaye's tenure was largely peaceful, but during his time in office Burundi was subject to several social and political disruptions. Among the former, the media recently liberaliste often used its freedom to discuss public issues in an inflammatory manner. Thousands of Burundian Hutu refugees who had fled during the violence of 1972 began returning en masse and demanding the reclamation of their property. Though Ndadaye suggested resettling them in vacant lands, many local officials made room for them by evicting others from their homes. Politically, Ndadaye's government re-examined several contracts and economic concessions made by the previous regime, posing a threat to Tutsi elite business interests. Military reforms also led to the separation of the gendarmeries command from the army, the replacement of the chiefs of staff of the army and gendarmerie, and new requirements for enrollment into the army were introduced. The army was due to open its annual recruitment drive in November, and there were fears among some Tutsi soldiers that this process would be altered in a way that would threaten their dominance of the institution. At some point a group of army personnel began planning a coup against Ndadaye's government. According to an officer in the Presidential Guard, one of the preparations taken by the plotters was to move troops from further postings into Bujumbura to grow the strength of the army. According to journalist Alexis Sinduhij, the putschists relied on a corporal, Enza Sabira, as an informant in the Presidential Guard. The exact identity of those who planned and organized the 1993 coup remains disputed. Army Chief of the General Staff Lieutenant Colonel Jean Bikomagu, ex-President Jean-Baptiste Bagaza, and former Minister of Interior François Ngeze are generally regarded as leading members. Bikomagu and Bagaza denied any involvement, while Ngeze said he had been forced to support the putsch. Others believed to have played a key planning role include Lieutenant Colonel Ngeze, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Kazatasa, Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Nyankuru, and Major Bernard Busakosa. Some human rights groups also suspected ex-President Buyoya of supporting the putschists. American diplomat Bob Kruger considered Buyoya to be the person chiefly responsible for the coup, as did Lieutenant Jean-Paul Kamana and Commandant Hilaire Ntakiyika, 2 soldiers who admitted to partaking in minor roles in the plot. Others suspected of involvement include Jerome Sinduhij, Alphonse Marie Kadej, Liberi Bararani Sce, Pascal Simbanjiku, Lieutenant Colonel Jean Bosco Daradangwe, François Bazindavai, Samuel Nduwing Oma, Laurent Nyankuru, UPRONA politician Charles Mukasai, Lieutenant Colonel Enzo Saba, Lieutenant Colonel Ende Isaba, Lieutenant Colonel Nyoyunguruza, Lieutenant Colonel Mergarej, Lieutenant Colonel Ninjuri, Lieutenant Colonel Pancrase Gyrakwigamba, Major Gervais Nemubona, Major Bukeza, Major Hazio, Lieutenant Antarataza, Lieutenant Ngomari Kaiza, Vincent Nyungiko, and George Makariko. The role of foreign influences is unknown. From 16 to October 18, 1993, Ndadaye attended a summit of Francophone heads of state in Mauritius. He returned to Burundi on the last day. During that time, Chief of the General Staff of the Gendarmerie Lieutenant Colonel Epitus Byagana Kangdi informed Minister of Defense Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ntakiri that he was in the possession of reliable reports which indicated a coup was being planned. On October 19, an army officer approached the wife of Minister of Communications Jean-Marie Ndadaye and informed her that personnel in the army headquarters were plotting against the president. At 1500 hours on October 20, Major Isai Nibazai, commander of the 2nd Commando Battalion, commandant of Camp Muha, and the officer responsible for presidential security informed Ndadaye's chef de cabinet about suspicious military movements. Later that afternoon, Ndadaye hosted a cabinet meeting in Bujumbura to mark the first 100 days of his presidency, which had passed 2 days prior, and discuss what his government had accomplished in comparison to its campaign promises. After the meeting, Ndadaye requested to speak in private with Ndadaye. In the president's office, Ndadaye raised concerns about Ndadaye's safety. Instead of informing the president about the vague threat his wife had learned of, he told him that he felt it strange that UPRONA, the Tutsi-dominated opposition party, was denouncing the government's popular policy of allowing thousands of Burundian refugees to return to the country before the commune elections in December. Ndadaye stated that he thought this would cost UPRONA the elections, and thus the only reason they would oppose the policy is if they planned to take power via assassination and a coup. He also requested that Ndadaye further consider a previous report declaring his security to be inadequate. Ndadaye instructed Ndadaye to bring him Minister of Defense Ndadaye. Ndadaye found Ndadaye in a separate room on a telephone call. Ambassador Melchior Ndadaye, who was also present, told Ndadaye that the colonel was being informed of a coup plot meant to move forward that night. Once Ndadaye finished the call, he and Ndadaye went to the president's office. Ndadaye told Ndadaye that a coup was being planned by the 11th Armored Car Battalion, which was going to attack the presidential palace at 2 o'clock on October 21. When asked how he would respond, Ndadaye said he would gather trusted officers and organize an ambush if the battalion left its camp. Ndadaye inquired about the status of Sylvestre Ngeze, the officer who had been arrested in July for attempting a coup, and asked if he could be relocated to a different prison so the putschists could not obtain his help. Ndadaye said that this would not be possible due to the objections of prison officials to transferring detainees at nighttime, but he assured the president that he would station an additional armored car at the presidential palace for extra security. Ndadaye spoke about training possibilities for the presidential guard before releasing both ministers and going to the palace. When he arrived, he told his wife, Lawrence, about the coup plot, but was mostly assured by what Ndadaye had said to him. 36B Ndadaye and his wife went to sleep, but he was awoken by a phone call from Brussels by J. Alfred Ndorisimpa, the Methodist Bishop of Burundi, who informed the president of rumors circulating among the Burundian expatriates in Brussels of an impending military coup. On October 22, Ngeze met with the Bujumbura Diplomatic Corps and representatives of international organizations at Kigo Palace. He explained that since the country was embroiled by crisis, he had taken power with the support of the army to restore order. His remarks were negatively received. That afternoon, protesters marched through the capital to commemorate Ndadaye and condemn the coup. All major providers of foreign aid to Burundi suspended their relief programs, particularly Belgium, France, Germany, the United States, and the European Union. The governments of Tanzania, Rwanda, and Zaire condemned the coup, as did the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in session in Cyprus, the Organization of African Unity, OAU, 79 United Nations Secretary-General Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the United Nations Security Council, and the United Nations General Assembly. Boutros-Ghali dispatched Special Envoy James O.C. Jonah to facilitate the return of the country to constitutional rule. Burundian religious leaders also requested that Bikomagu and Ngeze restore the constitution, while Minani declared that he was forming a government in exile in Kigali. The following day, several political parties, churches, and civic associations released a joint statement calling for a return to constitutional governance. Faced with these challenges, in the afternoon of October 23, Bikomagu, offering himself as a mediator between the putschists and the government, ordered the army to return to its barracks and asked for an amnesty for those involved in the coup attempt. Daradangwe urged the civilian government to assume command over the army. The government rejected amnesty for the putschists. The following day, Kinigi told reporters at the French embassy that her government had no power and appealed for countries with good relations with us to send us troops. In a broadcast via Radio Rwanda, Ndadaye asked the population to remain calm and asserted that once the government could assume its responsibilities it would apprehend those responsible for the coup. The army in turn rejected Kinigi's call of international armed intervention. On October 25 the civilian government declared the abrogation of all emergency measures, and the following day it re-established control over Burundi National Radio and Television, the state broadcaster. 2 days later the UPRONA parliamentary group declared its support for the civilian regime. On November 2 an OAU peace mission was dispatched to Burundi, and Kinigi and Bikomagu met to try and sort out their differences. On November 7 Kinigi left the French embassy and returned to her residence under the protection of French soldiers. The French government assigned approximately 15 anti-terror police officers and 20 military advisors to assist Kinigi's government and train a Burundian force to assume responsibility for its security. The UN Security Council ultimately declined to send a peacekeeping force to Burundi. Following the failure of the coup, Ngeze, Kamana, Major Bernard Busakosa, and 7 other Burundian soldiers fled to Kampala, Uganda. Kamana, who maintained that his only role in the coup was to serve as Ngeze's driver and bodyguard, said he fled upon realizing that he would be made a scapegoat by his superiors. Being a source of some embarrassment to Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, the soldiers were asked to leave in February 1994. They briefly stayed in Zaire before quietly returning to Uganda and eventually being detained in late November. In December 1993 the Burundian government announced the formation of a commission of inquiry to investigate crimes related to the coup attempt and subsequent massacres. The commission never materialized. Similar investigations were conducted by the military and civilian procuracies. The army arrested 18 soldiers suspected of involvement in Ndadaye's murder, but by the end of 1994 none of the accused had been tried. The civilian procuracy began its investigations in April 1994. They were conducted by teams of provincial magistrates but were undermined by the Tutsi-dominated judicial system. The prosecutors arrested several hundred people, almost all of them Hutus, but by the end of 1994 had not subjected any of them to trial. As required by the Convention de Gouvernement, in October 1994 President Ntibantunganya called for an international commission of inquiry to investigate the events of October 1993, but no immediate steps were taken to further this endeavor. In March 1994 Boutros Ghali sent a UN fact-finding mission to Burundi to investigate the coup attempt and subsequent massacres, but its findings were not made public. Further teams were sent by the UN Security Council and Boutros Ghali throughout 1994 and early 1995 to investigate the massacres, all concluding that the perpetrators of Ndadaye's murder should be held accountable. An international commission of inquiry for Burundi was eventually established in August 1995 by the UN Security Council. The body's investigation was obstructed by the Burundian military and it found inconsistencies in the testimonies of Tutsi officers. When interviewed about the events, senior commanders portrayed the coup as a mutiny. The commission concluded in its 1996 report that the coup was carried out by officers highly placed in the line of command of the Burundian army, but that it was not in a position to identify the persons that should be brought to justice for this crime. Some low-ranking Tutsi soldiers interviewed by the commission accused Buyoya of involvement in the coup, but they were later killed in a prison riot. Burundian authorities ultimately tried 117 people for involvement in Ndadaye's murder in 1999, during Buyoya's second presidency. Kruger characterized the proceedings as a show trial. In May the Supreme Court of Burundi found 79 of those tried guilty of involvement. 5 were sentenced to death: Kamana, who was in exile and tried in absentia, Laurent Nzeyimana, Juvenal Gahungu, Silvera Nduwumakama, and Emmanuel Ndadaye. The remaining 38 of those tried were acquitted, including Bikomagu, Anteke, and Nibazai. On October 19, 2020 the Supreme Court sentenced Buyoya to life in prison for Ndadaye's murder. Bernard Busakosa, Alphonse Marie Kadaj, and 16 others were also sentenced for involvement in the murder. Buyoya, who was abroad at the time serving as an envoy for the African Union, denounced the proceedings as a political trial conducted in a scandalous manner and resigned from his diplomatic position in order to have full freedom to defend myself and clear my name. He died in December 2020. Thank you for watching this video.